to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Rajiya Iqbal. 3 weeks after the US election, the formal handover of power from Donald Trump to President-elect Joe Biden has begun. His first and most important task, controlling the pandemic. We speak to someone on his newly created COVID-19 advisory board.
We have cases exploding, hospitals becoming overwhelmed, and behavior is just now starting to change, but we're still in a phase of uncontrollable spread.
Also, a special report from Afghanistan on the new drug of choice for this addict and many others, crystal meth.
Most people used to take heroin. Meth was very rare, but in the last 3 or 4 years, meth has become a lot more common, especially amongst young people.
And missing notebooks, Charles Darwin's, in which he explored the evolutionary relationship between species. Perhaps you can help find them. First, the latest world news.
Hello, I'm Aaron Safir with the BBC News. Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission has accused a youth group from the Tigray region of being behind a massacre earlier this month, in which it says more than 600 civilians were killed. The state-appointed commission says the group killed non-Tigrayan residents of the town of Maikadra 2 weeks ago with the collusion of local forces. Amnesty International highlighted reports of the massacre days later, but was unable to say who was behind it or exactly how many died. Kalkadan Yebeltal is in Addis Ababa.
The Commission's officials traveled to the area where these incidents have happened, and they said that at least 600 people were killed. They were killed by retreating Tigrayan forces and looks like an informal youth group. The report says that those that were killed were targeted due to their ethnicity. They killed them horribly. Some of them were stabbed, others were beaten by sticks, and others were set on fire.
The handover from Donald Trump to Joe Biden has officially begun 3 weeks after the US presidential election. In a tweet in which he referred to the best interests of the country, Mr. Trump acknowledged that the transition had started, but he said he would continue to challenge the outcome. The developers of Russia's Sputnik coronavirus vaccine say it will sell for less than $20 for 2 doses. That's cheaper than its American rivals, but more expensive than the Oxford University jab. The makers say interim analysis of data indicates that the vaccine is 95% effective. Here's Nomi Grimley.
Russian researchers are basing their efficacy calculations on 39 positive cases of COVID-19 in their clinical trials of more than 18,000 people. 8 were in the vaccine group compared to 31 cases in the placebo group. But there's been scepticism from many scientists around the world who worry the trials were too rushed compared with those of the other front-runners. So much will hinge on when the final results are published in an international medical journal.
The cleric who led the funeral service of the head of the Serbian Orthodox Church, who died with COVID-19, has himself contracted the disease. Guy Delorney reports.
Bishop David of Kruševac is the latest senior figure in the Serbian Orthodox Church to contract COVID-19. He's in hospital in Belgrade. The bishop didn't wear a mask at Sunday's funeral of Patriarch Irenei, and nor did any of the other senior clergy taking part. The chain of church-related coronavirus cases stretches back to the funeral of Montenegro's senior bishop at the start of the month. Metropolitan Amfilochie also died of COVID-19. He'd previously described pilgrimages as God's vaccine. Patriarch Irenei presided at his funeral and tested positive for coronavirus days later.
World news from the BBC. The family of a jailed Saudi women's rights activist, Lujain al-Hatlul, say they've been told she will have a hearing in her trial on Wednesday, the first for months. Lujain al-Hatlul had been detained for more than 2 years and recently started a hunger strike in protest at her conditions in prison. Last year, her trial and that of 10 other women's rights activists began in Riyadh. The EU's aviation safety regulator says it intends to approve the return to service of Boeing's 737 MAX plane after it was grounded last year following 2 deadly crashes. The regulator said after concluding its own thorough review, it's concluded the modified version is now safe to fly. China is increasing its control over popular live streaming websites which allow users to interact with online hosts and send them virtual gifts. Here's our Asia Pacific editor, Celia Hassan.
China's live streaming sites often attract daily audiences in the hundreds of millions, offering everything from live singing and dancing performances to language lessons. Next month, state control over live portals will increase. They'll be required to verify users' identities, while also hiring government-approved censors and notifying the authorities before major online events. People under 18 will also be banned from spending money on the portals. There have been several high-profile cases in China where children secretly spent their parents' life savings on gifts for live streaming stars.
A Hollywood director has apologised after he was caught making derogatory comments about the apartment of an actor during a virtual audition. Tristram Shapiro could be heard saying, "These poor people live in these tiny apartments," and bemoaning that a TV could be seen in the background. Unaware that he was unmuted, Mr. Shapiro was quickly cut off by the actor Lucas Gage. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Raziya Iqbal. Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. It comes to you live from London. We begin today in the United States, and for President-elect Joe Biden, it is beginning. The green light he has been waiting for has been given. Mr. Biden can now access federal funds denied to him since he was declared the winner of the election more than 2 weeks ago. An otherwise obscure department, the GSA, General Services Administration, was not releasing the money or initiating the opening of office space for the transition team to move in, so that there is a smooth transition of power after Joe Biden is inaugurated on January the 20th. The head of the GSA is a Trump appointee, Emily Murphy, and the green light came in a letter addressed to Mr. Biden and signed by Ms. Murphy. We've asked a colleague to voice a part of it.
Because of recent developments involving legal challenges and certifications of election results, I'm transmitting this letter today to make those resources and services available to you. I have dedicated much of my adult life to public service, and I have always strived to do what is right. Please note that I came to my decision independently, based on the law and available facts. I was never directly or indirectly pressured by any executive branch official, including those who work at the White House or GSA, with regard to the substance or timing of my decision.
The words of Emily Murphy, who referred there to the certification of election results, namely that the state of Michigan formally declared for Joe Biden yesterday, and the legal challenges mounted by the Trump campaign have one by one been dismissed by judges. Shortly after news of that letter came out, President Trump tweeted. He thanked Emily Murphy and he said that our case strongly continues. We will keep up the good fight and I believe we will prevail. Nevertheless, and this is the important bit, in the best interest of our country, I am recommending that Emily and her team do what needs to be done with regard to initial protocols and have told my team to do the same. That last sentence may be as close as President Trump is likely to come to concede that he lost the election. Following from that, Joe Biden's transition team released this statement. Today's decision is a needed step to begin tackling the challenges facing our nation, including getting the pandemic under control and our economy back on track. This final decision is a definitive administrative action to formally begin the transition process with federal agencies. All rather dry and procedural stuff, of course, but critically important in the context of transferal of power. Let's go to Washington and speak to our correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue. Gary, this does feel like it is as close to concession that we're likely to get from President Trump, but it also means something very significant, that there is money that has been released and access to very important security briefings and access to federal agencies.
Yes, and I think it's the second part of that that's the most significant thing for the Biden transitional administration. They've been saying for some time, look, on things like COVID, if we don't know what the plans are for distributing vaccines, for example, we could be weeks or even months behind when we take over on January the 20th while we catch up. So they're going to be very pleased about that. As you say, intelligence briefings, access to data and information and people in particular. particular, to try and make that transition as smooth as possible. The money, in a sense, is neither here nor there, but that access is important. There is a downside, I think, to that access, which means that, the transition to a Biden administration has now formally begun, which is a way of saying, this will suddenly become Joe Biden's problem from now on, in terms of the COVID in particular. It will become the Biden pandemic.
Gary O'Donoghue, our Washington correspondent, joining us live. Well, we've been hearing in the last couple of days about the emerging names in Joe Biden's inner circle and cabinet, including Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, etc. But as we've been hearing from our correspondent, the most important task facing the new president will be dealing with the pandemic. The numbers in the United States are rising. 257,707 deaths to date and 12,421,995 confirmed infections. I've been speaking to Dr. Atul Gawande, who is a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a professor at Harvard Medical School, and most recently was appointed as one of the people on Joe Biden's COVID-19 advisory board. I asked him first to reflect on those numbers.
The math is troubling, and the hospitals in the United States that are critically short of staff has now climbed over 1,000 hospitals. We have some states, such as North Dakota, where it's as many as half of the hospitals are in critical staff shortages. The two big issues are that staff get infected and then have to be pulled off the line. And of course, the increased spread of infections in the public means more patients coming in. And that's a very difficult combination, as has also clearly been seen in Europe. We have explosions of cases at a very similar level in Europe, the UK, and the United States. I think the concentration in the Midwest in the United States is putting it in new areas where we need better measures for control, including people wearing masks and staying out of crowded indoor spaces like bars and restaurants.
What do you think? How do you reflect when a hospital like the University of Nebraska Medical Center, which one assumed was one of America's best prepared hospitals, not least because it was the focal point of Ebola, but it was also the hospital where the very first COVID-19 patients were put, the best prepared hospital in the United States, that is now joining one of those hospitals that is critically short of staff. How do you reflect on how this has come to pass?
The pattern is repeated again and again, whether it was in Wuhan, where the hospitals became overwhelmed, then in Italy, then in Spain, then in New York, and in Boston, where I live. We are repeatedly late to take action against an invisible virus where half of us who are infected don't even know it. It requires all of us to take action, which involves sacrifices. The part of the difficulty for people is, where is the endpoint? And that's what the vaccines have really changed. They have given an indication to us that for the places hardest hit, the United States, Europe, we will have vaccines deploying to the general public as early as summer, with many of the most at-risk populations getting vaccines in the next couple months. And that really means that this is about getting through this holiday season and getting everyone through this tunnel alive to the other side.
But an awful lot of damage can be done between now and when the vaccines are being given to the public. And you have written that the questions facing Americans now are moral rather than technical, because it's quite clear that a country like the United States can cope with this if they had done the right things, and lives could have been saved. I wonder, through that lens, what advice you would be giving on this advisory panel to Joe Biden.
The knowledge has been there since spring that there are a few basic measures that can bring this under control. We've also learned since spring that targeted efforts based on how things are spreading can be highly effective, but we have not been unified in the United States. And I think with the new president-elect, we will have a comprehensive national strategy, which we've not had. It will include masks. It will include testing, which we've not committed to. It'll include getting the therapeutics that we now know work out to larger populations, and it will include a vaccine distribution strategy behind that. We just haven't had that commitment to clear communications, putting the scientists forward, and a comprehensive strategy that has had deep costs and moral dimensions. But I think we are on a much better path.
You say that you're on a much better path, and in 2 days' time, the United States will be marking Thanksgiving. It is a holiday when families get together, and we also know that this is the kind of disease that spreads exponentially inside. We now know that. What would you say to people? What are you going to do?
Well, no question. I've changed my family plans for both Thanksgiving and Christmas, where we were bringing people together from around the country. And that's simply not feasible. The better path is one that still takes us through some dark days in the weeks to come. We have cases exploding, hospitals becoming overwhelmed. Behavior is just now starting to change. We see it whether in Europe or in the United States that cases are starting to flatten out and begin to dip down in some of the most troubling spots. But we're still in a phase of uncontrollable spread. And it's going to take us through the next 4 to 6 weeks to really push that down. And we just haven't pulled together to begin doing that yet.
So it is quite possible, given that Joe Biden's not going to be in the White House until January the 20th, that lives will be lost that could have been saved.
We are past 1,000 deaths a day. It will climb to 2,000 deaths a day. And from very early on, it was clear we did not need to get to this point, that some basic consistent messaging and expectations around mask wearing and dealing with avoiding indoor crowding in particular would have made a huge difference. We're going to have to get started. We will have that messaging in the days to come after we get to have this transition in power. That means in the meantime, we'll do the best we can with what we have. The good news is we now have Republican governors aligning with Democratic governors to get the steps into place. Everybody is recognizing that the overwhelmed hospitals is a point you cannot simply tolerate.
The cultural shift is going to be much harder, even if you have Republican mayors and governors in states who say, actually, yes, we accept the mask mandate. What about all those people who have been persuaded by President Trump that their liberty is being taken away?
I've been talking to people all across the country throughout this, and one of the striking things is understanding that we have cast this to be more politicized than it should be. 80% of Americans are wearing masks. 75% of Republicans are wearing masks. There is a vocal and strong minority who have argued against masks, but even they're changing, right? There was what some called the red wall of states that vowed never to have mask mandates. But in the face of what's going on, we've now had 3 governors in the last week in Republican states who have put in mask requirements and put restrictions on capacity to begin dealing with the reality of the pace of spread. And those kinds of measures, they work, and that is starting to shift. So we hear more and more from scientists. You see the CDC being more emboldened. You see the FDA clearly sticking to the science around the vaccines, is that the voices explaining that this is not about your freedom to wear a mask. When you don't wear a mask in a store, you are putting the people immediately around you at risk. You're threatening their freedom. You're threatening their health. And by the way, you're also scaring people away from going to those shops and to those stores. And therefore, you're also hurting jobs. And people recognize that.
That was Dr. Atul Gawande, surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital, professor at Harvard Medical School, and most recently one of the people appointed on Joe Biden's COVID-19 advisory board. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour. Still to come in today's programme, we have a report on Afghanistan's growing role as a major producer of the drug methamphetamine.
The realisation that you could produce methamphetamine from a wild crop in the mountains, this ephedra crop, has been a fundamental game changer. You've gone from the use of imported over-the-counter medicines at a high cost to being able to use a low price commodity that is growing in its abundance and simple chemistry.
Do stay with us for that report from Afghanistan. The BBC News headlines this hour. Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission has accused a Tigrayan youth group of carrying out a massacre of more than 600 civilians earlier this month as the conflict in the Tigray region escalates. This is Rajiya Iqbal with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. Cambridge University Library has reported the disappearance of 2 of Charles Darwin's notebooks to police 20 years after they went missing. One of them contains his famous Tree of Life sketch, which demonstrated part of his thinking on the origin of species. Curators now believe they were stolen. I've been speaking to Dr. Jessica Gardner. She's the university's librarian. She told me first more about the notebooks.
Well, these are really precious. They're the handwritten notebooks as part of a much bigger archive. The University Library of Cambridge holds the largest archive of Charles Darwin manuscripts and books anywhere in the world. These 2 notebooks are part of a sequence that were written in 1837 and 1838 after Darwin had returned from voyages in the HMS Beagle. They're known as the Transmutation Notebooks, and they're part of his developing ideas, which lead 20 years later to the publication of On the Origin of Species. And what's really significant about one of these 2 notebooks is that it contains a seminal sketch. It's probably just about 2 inches tall, absolutely tiny, known as the Tree of Life. And this is the first sketch that Darwin then went on to rework in other sketches and writing as part of his thinking towards on the origin of species.
So I'm looking at a picture of it. So it is just very small with the Tree of Life picture and then just some writing on the side. And I suppose it's also just the writing, his own handwriting, that is also so powerful.
It really is. I mean, it's magical. I've worked my whole career in the preservation of cultural heritage, and coming to Cambridge, working the Darwin papers, that was, really a combination of a career for me. So I am absolutely devastated by what has happened. It's really, really special to see his handwriting. We hold over 8,000 letters to and from Darwin and many other notebooks, drafts of his books. But these 2 notebooks are very special. We have published the digital versions fully online our website, so anyone can see what is contained in his own handwriting online. But we know that's not the same as the original objects, and that's what we want to recover for the world.
I understand that you want your focus to be on recovering these items, but it will strike people as strange that for 20 years you were just relying on them, not you personally, but Cambridge University was relying on them just to turn up.
Well, today I'll be very clear. Our protocols are absolutely clear that if anything like this happened again, and I've taken considerable measures to help ensure that it does not, we would report to the police immediately, as well as doing those wide-scale searches.
Theft hadn't been ruled in as a possibility at the outset.
And I don't want to apportion blame to my predecessors, but I do take responsibility today, and that responsibility has led me to report to the police and to move as openly as possible with this public appeal and reach as wide as possible as audience to reach their recovery.
I mean, these notepads are worth millions of dollars, aren't they? So the likelihood of somebody coming forward would really be dependent on somebody being interested in restoring them to their original place. But you can argue and you can imagine, can't you, that there are going to be people who, if they do have it and know now what they're worth, that it could go in a different direction.
Well, there is no way these notebooks could be sold on the open market, and that's been one of the ways in which we have spent time listening and gaining expertise from our colleagues in the international book trade. So, this is where there are examples where consciences are pricked, or just some information that leads to, the next bit of fact that we hope will lead to the recovery. They can't be sold in the open market. They're too well known. Their provenance is too well known. Darwin is highly collectible. We know that. But I also, travel hopefully in the, goodness that someone will hear this and think, I know something. Let's try and return that so the world can benefit from it in the public domain.
Dr. Jessica Gardner, the librarian at Cambridge University. Now, Taiwan, Germany, New Zealand and Finland, all countries with female leaders, have been praised for their handling of the pandemic, leading some to ask whether the gender of our leaders matters in times of crisis. Finland's Sanna Marin is the world's youngest serving Prime Minister and heads a coalition of 5 parties, all led by women. The BBC's had exclusive access behind the scenes to explore how that coalition works in practice as the Prime Minister discusses Finland's new equality programme. The BBC's gender and identity correspondent, Mega Mohan, spent a week with Prime Minister Sanna Marin and Finland's all-female cabinet.
Please enter the conference password.
Helsinki's House of the Estates is about to host the world's youngest female Prime Minister and her history-making all-female-led centre-left coalition government as they discuss their new equality programme.
Finland has had coalition governments forever. So of course we are used to trying to make compromises and trying to find consensus between different parties and ideologies. And I think it's also a big strength for us.
Sanna Marin leads a coalition of 5 parties, all led by women, 4 of them in their 30s. Left Alliance leader and Minister of Education Li Andersson says that itself results in stereotypes.
There is kind of this tendency of some people to say that because there is women, you will make a certain type of policy, or it's easier for you to agree when you're all women and so on. And that's not, I think, necessarily the case. And that's why I also want there to be a focus around policy.
Alongside Germany, Taiwan and New Zealand, Finland's female-led government has been praised for its quick, decisive response to coronavirus. Finland has some of the lowest death rates in the world. But Prime Minister Marin says that gender has nothing to do with their success.
Well, of course, there are countries led by men that have also done well. So I don't think it's a gender-based issue. The most important thing is that we try to make the decisions based on the best knowledge that we can use, and also that we are trying to make decisions in a way that helps ordinary people in their ordinary lives, in crisis and also in normal times.
A government praised for its progressive representation, but some of its leaders are still reluctant to celebrate it quite yet.
I think the representation with 5 white, educated females is not very representative in the end. If we really look at the equality here, it doesn't show yet.
That was Maria Ohisalo, one of the 5 party leaders. One of the issues being addressed in the equality programme is gender minorities. Trans rights activists have for years asked for reform to the Trans Act, a law that currently requires those seeking legal gender recognition to be infertile or undergo sterilisation.
We have had a female president, we have the youngest female leader of country, but alone that doesn't, it's just a token alone. It has to have the support of the system behind it before it actually makes a difference.
That was trans rights activist Kasper Kavisto speaking. And I put it to Prime Minister Marin that it's been 3 years since the European Court of Human Rights said that sterilisation should not be required in order to recognise personal gender identity, but that's still the case in Finland. She was adamant that her government believed in self-identification.
Everyone should have the right to determine their own identities.
Sanna Marin's advisors told me that changes to the Trans Act are tabled to come in next year. Sisu is a Finnish word meaning quiet, steely stoicism, the ability to get things done without a fuss. It's been used quite a lot to describe this cabinet. Sanna Marin enjoyed an 85% approval rating in her first year of government. But there are challenges ahead. Every coalition prime minister over the past 20 years in Finland has resigned. Although Finland's coalition don't want to be judged for their gender, there's every chance that it will be named as a reason for their success or failure.
That was Mega Mohan, the BBC's gender and identity correspondent, with that report behind the scenes in Finland's all-female cabinet. Do tell us what you think about what you hear on our programme. At BBC World Service is the network's Twitter handle. At Rajiya Iqbal is mine if you want to speak to me directly.
This is the BBC World Service, looking at climate change.
A climate study endorsed by 11,000 scientists warns there'll be untold human suffering unless...
The message is stark.
These aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science.
Climate change is affecting people across the world.
In Phoenix, it is hot all the time, during the day and during the night. This heat is not normal.
Part of Bangladesh has been affected by the floods. We have more than 15,000 people displaced.
We've got fires that are still burning, transforming landscapes, wiping out wildlife.
So how do we face these challenges?
Each week we'll talk to our journalists on the ground and hear how the crisis is unfolding right in front of their eyes.
And we'll bring together leading experts to hear how we might make a better future.
Join Neil Rizal and Greer Jackson for The Climate Question, Monday at 2 and 9 GMT.
Still to come on NewsHour in the next 30 minutes, how Sweden, so long reluctant to impose coronavirus restrictions, is now telling citizens to avoid mixing. We also have a report on the rise in the production of crystal meth in Afghanistan and allegations of human rights violations in Ethiopia. First, let's have a summary of the latest world news.
BBC News with Aaron Safir. Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission has accused a youth group from the Tigray region of being behind a massacre earlier this month, in which it says more than 600 civilians were killed. The state-appointed commission says the group stabbed, bludgeoned and burned to death non-Tigrayan residents in the town of Maykadra. The handover from Donald Trump to Joe Biden has officially begun 3 weeks after the US presidential election. In a tweet in which he referred to the best interest of the country, Mr. Trump acknowledged that the transition had started. The developers of Russia's Sputnik coronavirus vaccine say it will sell for less than $20 for 2 doses. That's cheaper than its American rivals, but more expensive than the Oxford University jab. The makers say interim analysis of data indicates that the jab is 95% effective. France's Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin has ordered an investigation into the way police dispersed a migrants camp in central Paris on Monday night. Officers used tear gas to clear the camp in the Place de la République. There were also scuffles. The cleric who led the funeral service of the head of the Serbian Orthodox Church, who died with COVID-19, has himself contracted the disease. Bishop David of Kruševac was tested after the funeral on Sunday of Patriarch Irenei. A posthumous appeal on behalf of the man found guilty of the Lockerbie bombing in 1988 has started in a court in Scotland. Abdul Basit al-Megrahi was the only person convicted of blowing up a passenger plane over Lockerbie in Scotland, killing 270 people. China is increasing censorship on popular live streaming websites, which allow users to interact with online hosts and send them virtual gifts. They'll be required to verify the identities of their users while also hiring government-approved censors. BBC News.
Welcome back to NewsHour. We'll have a report from Afghanistan next about the alarming rise in the production of the drug crystal meth. First, though, to Sweden, which has been an outlier when it comes to imposing lockdowns in the face of COVID-19 infections. But as the number of deaths and infections surges there, the government has been forced to introduce tougher regulations. Let's go to Sweden and speak to our correspondent, Maddie Savage. Maddie, do outline for us first the restrictions, the new restrictions. Is it law or is it just being advised?
We've got some tougher laws coming in Sweden, a country that has largely relied on voluntary responsibility, voluntary guidelines since the start of the pandemic. So from today, a ban on meetings of more than 8 people has been introduced. That's public events, things like concerts, sports, competitions and demonstrations. People will still be able to gather privately without facing the possibility of a fine. But the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, has really put a lot of pressure on the Swedish public. He's asked them to try and only socialise with people they live with, saying that everyone's actions could make a difference to slow down the spread of the virus.
And what are the penalties for not adhering to those rules?
For the public events, these kind of events where you would need a licence, you could face a fine or up to 6 months in prison. But as I say, to go round to somebody's house, there's no restriction on whether you have 8 people, 9 people. There is another ban on when it comes to serving alcohol after 10 p.m. That's an important change that also happened last Friday. And there's a rule of 8 at tables in bars, again, to try and stop household mingling outside your own household.
And how would you characterise the public mood then in Sweden in response to these tougher measures?
I think it's mixed. Swedes are very aware of the fact that they've had more relative freedom than most Europeans during the pandemic, and I think some are quite disappointed that those freedoms are being curbed. But I think on the other hand, there is trust in Swedish public authorities. I think there is an acceptance that things need to be done to try and slow down the spread of the virus. One other key aspect to this is immunity. The Swedish Public Health Agency predicted that things wouldn't be as bad for Sweden as other European countries at this point in the pandemic because they thought immunity levels would be higher. There's no evidence to clearly support that at this stage. So I think the public are, in some ways understanding of the government's approach to toughen its tone and try and find ways to slow down the spread of the virus. And I think more people, from what we're seeing, are starting to work from home more and avoid public transport, which they've been asked to do since the beginning of the pandemic, but seem to sort of get a bit lax on in the last couple of months.
And Maddie, just bring us up to date then, the reason why the authorities are enforcing these new laws. What are the numbers in Sweden?
Quite simply, we are seeing thousands of COVID-19 cases a day compared to dozens or just a few hundred a couple of months ago. And there are a lot of concerns on what that will mean for hospital beds as we enter a long winter.
Maddie Savage, our correspondent, joining us live from Sweden. Lots, obviously, on coronavirus on our website, bbc.com/news. You're listening to News Hour from the BBC. I'm Rajiya Iqbal. A new report warns that Afghanistan is becoming a significant producer of the dangerously addictive and illegal drug methamphetamine, or crystal meth. Afghanistan is, of course, already the source of the majority of the world's heroin, but the research carried out by the European Union's drug monitoring body warns meth production could eventually become an even bigger industry. In recent months, there have been multiple international seizures of vast quantities of the drug suspected to originate from Afghanistan, with street values of tens of millions of dollars. Sikandar Kamani reports from Kabul.
Under a busy bridge, nestled amongst the filthy water and discarded rubbish, a grim community of desperate men addicted to drugs. Some are passed out, others huddled together, inhaling white smoke through glass pipes. For years, heroin use has been a major problem here in Kabul, but now many are turning to a new, cheaper fix, crystal meth. Kudadad has been addicted to both substances for the past 5 years.
When I first started taking drugs, most people used to take heroin. Meth was very rare, but in the last 3 or 4 years, meth has become a lot more common, especially amongst young people. If you look under this bridge, it's not a place for human beings. It's not even fit for a dog.
Afghanistan's poppy fields already produce the vast majority of the world's heroin. Now it's emerging as a major producer of crystal meth, another dangerously addictive illegal drug. The boom has been fueled by the discovery that a plant growing wild in Afghanistan can be used to make the core ingredient, ephedrine. Poor Afghans in rural communities can produce it in makeshift labs. One video we've been sent simply shows a bare room with a huge metal pot on the stove.
This is a classic ephedrine lab. It has all of the telltale signs. There is the wastewater that is a byproduct of the process.
Using satellite images, a team of researchers led by Dr. David Mansfield from Britain has been tracking the growth of these ephedrine labs. They found more than 300 in one district alone.
The realisation that you could produce methamphetamine from a wild crop in the mountains, this ephedra crop, has been a fundamental game changer. You've gone from the use of imported over-the-counter medicines at a high cost to being able to use a low-price commodity that is growing in its abundance and simple chemistry.
In the past, the US has carried out airstrikes on suspected drugs labs, but they're so easy to rebuild, the campaign soon stopped. The Taliban, though, do charge taxes from the traffickers. On the condition of anonymity, one smuggler told us how it worked.
The Taliban say, for now, there's a war going on, so it's allowed. But when the right time comes, they will stop it. They first collect a tax from the farmer when the crop is being harvested. Then there's another tax when the drugs are being transported.
There have been huge seizures of meth suspected to be from Afghanistan by the Sri Lankan authorities in the Arabian Sea and even as far away as Australia. There are warnings it could make its way to Europe too.
I think the analogy I use, if you can hide something in any item, we've probably seen drugs concealed in those items.
Andrew Parkinson has been leading a team in the Australian Federal Police, conducting a forensic analysis of the meth they've seized, including more than $50 million worth dissolved into mineral water bottles earlier this year.
And what we are seeing and what we are monitoring is an increase in methamphetamine coming from Afghanistan and the surrounding countries around there. So all the profiling results that we have received from these seizures indicates to us that the starting product is the ephedra plant. Obviously, that for us, that yields critical information.
Afghan meth may be going worldwide, but it's causing misery here in Kabul too. Back by the bridge, one man tells us he's been searching for his brother for months after he became addicted. Our mother died because of the stress, he tells me. With instability continuing, the amount of meth being produced and the number of lives being ruined is likely to rise.
That report from Afghanistan was from our correspondent, Sikandar Kamani. Egypt has dismissed international criticism of the arrest of 4 members of one of the country's leading human rights organisations. The arrests came after they had met with foreign ambassadors. Several European states, the US and the UN have also condemned the detention this week of members of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. And today, another prominent pro-democracy activist in Egypt, Alaa Abdel Fattah, has been put on a terrorism list along with more than 20 others accused of having joined the Muslim Brotherhood. I've been speaking to Hossam Baghat, who is the founder and president of Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. He told me his colleagues are suffering from inhumane conditions in prison and can't even buy food, nor are given blankets at night.
We were never told, of course, or at least we were never given one version. Our senior staff that were arrested are 3 so far, 3 directors, including the organization's top executive. They were all arrested in the span of last week, like one day in between. And, you know, they were interrogated initially on a visit earlier this month to our offices by 13 ambassadors of different Western countries accredited in Cairo that actually requested to come and visit the organization and discuss our work and our methods and different aspects of the human rights situation. But then once they appeared before the prosecutors, the line of questioning moved away from the visit into all of what we have been doing, all of our activism over the last 18 years, particularly in the last 6 years under President Sisi, and looking specifically at issues of documentation and fact-finding on police brutality, the criminal justice system, unfair trials, and the mass executions and death sentences that have been handed down in terrorism-related and political trials. Of course, the government has publicly, the foreign ministry ministry in Egypt has even a third line, which is that we are being interrogated because our papers are not in order, we don't have the right NGO permissions, etc. It comes down to one thing: whatever the context, the pretext, the public line, we know we are now being interrogated, and in an attempt to decapitate the organization for all it has been doing over the past few years.
And no charges, as far as you're concerned, have been brought?
No, all three of our senior directors have been charged with membership of a terrorist organization. Now, it sounds laughable and ludicrous, of course, because we are an organization that has been pushing for and fighting for 18 years for open society and universal human rights values. We are known for our work on defending free speech, freedom of artistic expression, sexual and reproductive rights of all Egyptians, as well as protection of freedom of religion.
What's happened to your colleagues in the EIPR is part of a larger crackdown, is it not? Because there are others who have been arrested under the same pretext.
Of course. When President Sisi first came to power, he changed the anti-terrorism law. So the law after the change now equates terrorism with literally any effort to undermine national security or public peace. And the public peace part, of course, has been used to designate people as terrorists for anything and nothing.
Is it the case that they can all be held, including your colleagues, in remand for 2 years?
The lucky ones can be held in remand detention for up to 2 years, unfortunately. President Sisi did not want to copy Mubarak, who used a state of emergency that lasted 30 years to use administrative detention to keep thousands and thousands of political prisoners without charge or trial. So currently the system pretends that this is a judicial process, pretends that this is pre-trial detention, pretends that there are charges that are being examined, but in reality, these thousands of political prisoners, way more than Mubarak ever kept in detention, are actually in open-ended, remand detention. And even when they meet the cap of the 2 years and they are ordered release by the power of the law, the prosecutors immediately bring in new charges. There's exactly the same charges, but just with a different case number. So we start the clock again from day one. After the 2 years, there are people that have been in detention for 4 or 5 or 6 years. Actually, a fourth member of my organization, of the EIPR, a researcher working on gender and LGBT issues, has been detained on similar charges since last February, purportedly in pre-trial detention, but there is no interrogation. There is no new evidence. He has not been brought before any court. He just sits in jail, and every 40 days he gets another renewal for another 45 days. This is the cautionary tale, of course, and we are calling for all 4 of our staffers to be released immediately before they get sucked into and swallowed into this black hole of, pre-trial detention with no end.
I wonder if, just very briefly, if you are hopeful that President-elect Joe Biden is going to be occupying the White House in January. He has famously said that there would be no more blank checks for Donald Trump's favorite dictator, referring to General Sisi.
Of course, it is going to be an improvement. And I mean, the bar is so low, and the last 4 years have been so terrible in terms of not just turning a blind eye from the Trump administration, but even encouraging and cheering and lauding and congratulating President Sisi and his government for being so firm and which, of course, reads, so authoritarian and brutal with his people. But we are encouraged by President-elect Biden's public signaling during his campaign that he wants to end this favorite dictator status and end the blank check. We are encouraged as well by Tony Blinken's public expression of condemnation of the crackdown on our organization just 3 or 4 days before he was designated as the next Secretary of State. And we know, of course, that the Egyptian regime is using us and using our staff to signal to the West suggest, and particularly to the incoming Biden administration, that there is a price for showing any concern, collective or individual, for human rights conditions in Egypt, and that Egypt will not tolerate or welcome such collective action or collective attention to its human rights record. So it could, of course, work in our favor if Western governments and the Biden administration take this challenge seriously, or the new administration could actually work against us, because we would be used as a pawn in a war, or at least a signaling from the Egyptian government to their American counterparts.
That was Hossam Bagat, who is the founder and president of Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, Egypt's leading human rights organizations.
Now a look at what else you can hear from the BBC World Service. In 10 minutes, People Fixing the World looks at making railway journeys greener.
We have 30 kilowatts of solar panels on the train shed roof at the northern terminus. So when the train comes in at the end of the day, the train plugs into that solar bank and the train's recharged.
And online, we explore how astrophysical ideas and techniques have evolved.
By looking at the light coming from the galaxy and comparing it to what we'd expect to see if it wasn't moving, we can then figure out how fast it's going. And there's this thing called redshift, because again, it's like shifted towards the redder part of light.
And hear the mushroom woman's fascination with growing mushrooms.
We are growing mushrooms using different kind of materials. Here you see that we grow on wheat straw, corn cobs, corn stalks.
That's all at bbcworldservice.com. Now it's back to NewsHour with Rajiya Iqbal.
And a reminder of our top story this hour. 3 weeks after the US presidential election, the formal handover of power from Donald Trump to President-elect Joe Biden has begun. Their top priority will be to deal with the pandemic. Dr. Atul Gawande is on Mr. Biden's new COVID task force. He told this programme that the pandemic remains a significant challenge.
We have explosions of cases at a very similar level in Europe, the UK, and the United States. I think the concentration in the Midwest in the United States is putting it in new areas where we need better measures for control, including people wearing masks and staying out of crowded indoor spaces like bars and restaurants.
Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission has accused a Tigrayan youth group of carrying out a massacre of more than 600 civilians earlier this month as the conflict in the Tigray region escalates. More on that in just a moment. This is NewsHour, live from the BBC in London. Let's turn to Ethiopia now and the northern province of Tigray. Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission has accused a youth group from the region of being behind a massacre earlier this month in which it says more than 600 civilians were killed. Fighting is still continuing between the forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Force and the Ethiopian army. UN aid workers have warned that emergency relief supplies are running out. A spokesman for the UN Humanitarian Affairs Agency said it had been blocked from sending staff or supplies. Let's speak to the BBC's Kalkadan Yibeltal, who joins us from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Kalkadan, let's start first with these killings that the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has been talking about. Tell us more.
Yes, this report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is now supporting of an earlier report by Amnesty International. At the time, Amnesty International called what happened in the Tigrayan town of Maikadra a massacre. At the time, it says that scores and even hundreds were killed. So now the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is saying that those killed are more than 600 and it could even be higher. And it seems that what the Commission is accusing of a youth group in that state and also retreating Tigrayan forces of killing non-ethnic Tigrayans living in those areas. And it seems that they were killed in a pretty gruesome fashion. Some of them were stabbed, some of them were beaten by sticks, and others were burned on fire.
It all sounds pretty awful. We are in the middle of a very serious conflict here. Did the Commission explain how it was able to investigate this?
The commission said that its officials traveled to those areas and managed to talk to some of the residents there and visit some of the hospitals and meet some of the survivors there. Earlier, Tigrayan authorities had denied these accusations and they called for independent investigation. Since there is a communications blackout in that area, starting from the breaking out of this conflict exactly 3 weeks ago, it's been very difficult to independently verify what's going on there. But what we know for sure is the civilian cost, the human cost of this conflict is very high, and we're hearing horrible and tragic stories day by day now.
Indeed, not least from those people who are fleeing the conflict and going into Sudan, which we've tried to cover here too. Tell us what we know now, given the information blackout of the fighting on the ground. The government forces say they're trying to surround Mekelle city in Tigray, and there's been a deadline for those forces to lay down their arms. What can you tell us?
The government claims that it has controlled all the major cities in the state except the capital Mekelle, towards which it says it's advancing. And the other day, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed gave a 72-hour ultimatum for Tigrayan forces to surrender peacefully. But it looks like that ultimatum is not being accepted by Tigrayan authorities, because yesterday top Tigrayan authorities were speaking and they said that they reject these claims, they reject these calls, and they are going to fight against what they call invaders. That's what they call the federal army. So it looks like the fighting is going on.
The BBC's Kalkadan Yibeltal joining us live from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Now that we have 3 vaccine trials that have shown impressive results in their phase 3 trials, the questions we all want answered is what next? How quickly will regulators approve the vaccines, and how quickly can they be distributed to those who need them most and first? We heard yesterday about how this undertaking of vaccinating the entire world has never been done before, so clearly many challenges lie ahead. A short time ago, I spoke to Professor Sir Gordon Duff. He is an eminent scientist and immunologist, and he's also been a regulator and advisor to the UK government on the safety of medicines and vaccines. He talked me through the process.
All of the research and development that's been done on these vaccines has to be written up into a dossier and then submitted as an application to the appropriate regulatory authority. And once that dossier is received, it will be scrutinized extremely carefully. We also have in the United Kingdom a statutory independent body, the Commission on Human Medicines, and all of the dossier will be reviewed by members of that commission, and what will be the recommendation through the MHRA to the licensing authority, which is government or the Secretary of State for Health, will be that the benefits of the vaccine, if it's a positive recommendation, that the benefits far exceed the risks, even if the risks are notional and theoretical.
Presumably, the people who were conducting the phase 3 trials were doing exactly that. Are the regulators, do they act like monitors? Are they kind of marking the work that we've already seen the scientists do?
The regulators will inspect sites and will inspect production sites and clinical trial sites and so on. The regulators will authorize the clinical trial in the first place. Normally, it wouldn't be such a coordinated process as this has been during the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, there is an expedited approach where the regulator and the developers of the vaccine are walking in step. As soon as a very early phase was completed, the results, the data from that would be submitted and be appraised. When we get to the end, a lot of the information has already been evaluated.
There's clearly a need for urgency given what the world is going through. Is it likely that the regulators will be under pressure to rush this through?
They will not drop their standards or cut any corners. They will go at the analysis with just the same rigor as they do all the time. The reason that it can happen quickly is because of the rolling nature, coordinated nature of the development of the regulation. I can assure you that the final process, the final evaluation, will be as rigorous or more rigorous than anything we've seen before.
Eminent scientist and immunologist, Professor Sir Gordon Duff, speaking to me a little earlier. And he brings us to the end of this edition of NewsHour. Thanks for your company this past hour. Till the next time. Bye-bye.